I guess the background is I always had like an entrepreneurial spirit from a pretty young age, from early teens, and I enjoyed beer at a fairly young age, although it wasn't the highest quality beer, and attended Washington State and called it 4 years of research and development. Studied entrepreneurship there and worked on different business plans and a really really diverse program that gave you a lot of different disciplines, overviews of a lot of things, and some real-world contact with businesses that needed help. And between, I guess, like my junior year of college, I went to a beer festival, and people were like smiling and excited to be at work, and I was blown away that people were so passionate while they were working. And I loved beer, so it just kind of started from there, I guess, and did a little home brewing in college. And then between my junior and senior year of college, I wanted to do an internship and get some real-world experience. So I reached out to a bunch of breweries in the Northwest and asked them if they ever did internships. Most of them didn't have a program, so I just offered to work for free. I ended up at a local brew pub that's pretty good sized, and at first it was shadowing the general manager, and I said, the restaurant general management thing is not what I want to do, and I ended up just labeling bottles and cleaning kegs for the brewery, so just the true kind of entry-level, bottom-of-the-barrel stuff, and that's where I met my business partner, and it's all the cliche stuff. We took a scrap piece of paper at one of the tables and scratched down a couple ideas. And I went back to my senior year, and from that kind of napkin, fresh sheet piece of paper was starts of a business plan. And oh man, I graduated college and we started working on the business plan more, and we were able to put together a tiny amount of seed money when we saw a brewery go out of business in Seattle. And so we were able to purchase the equipment at a great price, just the right size system for us, but we didn't have a place to put it, so we stashed it in storage while we started looking for a physical location. And it was a challenging time. This is like 2007, 2008. So we had a lot of investors kind of queued up for what we were going to do, even on a relatively small scale, but they were immediately said, I got to wait 6 months, I got to wait a year and kind of see how the market goes. And so it became a lot more challenging to put together the capital needed. And so we probably pitched the business plan to 40 to 50 at least different individuals before we ended up putting together just enough seed money to get into a physical location. And we were broke, and we built out the space ourselves and building permits, and we were sinking the last screws in, and it was January 9th, like 2008, and the building caught fire. And so a neighboring business left a space heater on underneath the desk, and 2 alarm fire tore through the building and took out all the hard work, and we literally had our final building inspection the next morning. And so luckily we were insured from day one, so there's a great tip, is be insured at the moment, and that's the only reason that we're here today. But things happen for a reason, I find. I think that we've been really fortunate in that sometimes I believe in a little destiny, and that turned into a complete blessing. The space was undersized and never would have had a retail element to it, which is key for our business. And the fire allowed us to move into a space that was twice the amount of square footage with a retail tap room to interact with the public. And those were key defining things in us having some amount of success and working forward.
Can I ask you a question about that space?
Yeah.
That space is huge. Did you envision?
Across here?
Yeah.
No, we've been surprised. We had the fire, and when we were building out that space, there was a QFC grocery store just like 200 yards down from us. And we were buying sandwiches and 6-packs at the grocery store while we were building out the space. And the fire happened, and we got set up in a location where we first started brewing beer. We were there for 3 years, and then we actually moved in and took over that QFC grocery store that closed. And so to think 3 years later that we actually took over and inhabited a grocery store that we were buying sandwiches when we were first building it out was crazy. And that seemed like a ton of space. We got up to about 15,000 square feet in that location. And then we've outgrown enough spaces to where we got enough years under our belt to where we felt like it was time to own our own building. And so breweries invest a lot of money in infrastructure and our manufacturing operations, and lease negotiations and landlords are always interesting depending on different scenarios. And so we just had a lot of typical, I think, pains from landlords and that type of thing. And so we were excited to plant our flag in the ground and have our own real estate and improve long-term assets. It's like owning a home. You want to build equity. And then we started looking, and this was just, it looked insane when I walked in at first. It didn't seem fathomable that we would have this come to fruition. And then you dig in a little deeper and you start doing some planning and forward thinking. And I think that a lot of times in business you end up being very reactionary for many years, tackling problems as they get dropped on your lap. And then as time goes on, you're able to start doing some more planning and getting ahead of that. And so we were able to sit down and really do some planning about our future and what we wanted to do production-wise long-term when we looked at this space. And then you got to be a risk taker. So you got to, take the leap sometimes and not overanalyze. I heard some interesting fact about entrepreneurs. It's like you'll never have all the facts to make a decision. At some point you need to understand that you gather enough of the facts and then you got to make a decision, move on to the next. Because you can spend your whole time trying to get 100% of the details, and in the meantime, the opportunities passed you up. And you got to be willing to take a leap and make judgments and make quick decisions. So this is insane, but I think that we have a vision, and we don't mind taking risks, but they're calculated risks, and it's all those little nuances, right? Feelings and the development happening in the area. Tacoma as a neighbor, knowing that this was primed for revitalization and growth. And for us, we didn't want to be in Fife in a warehouse park. We wanted walkability. We wanted families to be able to access us and feel safe. And the retail component for breweries is key. And we wanted to make sure that we've always been surprised over the years how the retail element has grown and become substantial in our business, and made sure that that was going to be healthy and at the same time have room to grow, and affordable real estate and history of the building was just an insanely huge added bonus.
Can you give us an example when you were starting, you want to brew beer, then you spend all this time and effort in college, and you're talking about opening a brewery in a recession, and how the heck do you convince investors to say, hey, believe in me, or your families and friends to do this?
Well, there's a couple things, I guess. We didn't plan it this way, but luckily alcohol is somewhat a recession-proof business. If anything, it actually sells better in a recession, and so there's just those few businesses that make it through recessions fairly unscathed. And so that was somewhat fortunate. I think that when investors get pitched, they invest in people, not always ideas. And so your character, your passion, I think is what they're sizing up. And if you possess those qualities, that's usually, I think, what people are looking for. And maybe the idea sucks, but maybe your passion is so strong that this person says, hey, when you do get a different idea, I know that we're going to do something together. Or maybe there's an opportunity, because it all whittles down to people and the drive, the motivation that only so many people possess, I guess I think that, small business isn't for the light of heart. It's hard to operate a small business in this current climate, I think that we carry most of the weight. Small businesses in the country. It's much easier to go to business for a huge multinational corporation that gets reduced prices for healthcare and legal teams and all these things that as a small business you pay a premium to be able to offer your employees, and you just can't take any excuses. I guess the faint of heart thing is something breaks, you can't cry about it. You can't expect someone to come fix your problems for you. You have to gather your shit up and put a smile on your face and solve the problem. And I don't think there's anything that truly prepares you for that. Maybe parenthood, where that child is dependent on you and you don't have a choice but to figure it out. And that's maybe the one other parallel you can draw where, not for the faint of heart, and you got to be willing to do what it takes.
So can I ask you, have you found to be the most effective way to motivate your employee?
What's the best way to motivate? Positive motivation and, communication. I think that everyone wants to be respected, and so making sure that people are heard and that they're respected. And I think there's a lot of basics like compensation, making sure to have fair compensation, making sure to treat people fairly across the board. I think that offering benefits that are, when you can, above the minimum threshold. Although I think the reality is that now you're required to do so much at a minimum level that it's challenging to go above and beyond. So minimum wage, healthcare, things that are now required, whereas before it was going above and beyond. And now it's required, and now sometimes to an extreme sense, that actually inhibits business growth, It's not, I think that sometimes there's a vision of like presidents or CEOs or people that run companies as driving the bottom line and strictly wanting to make as much money as possible. And I think that's sometimes that people's view of success, right? Some people's opinion of success is financial success. Are you getting rich? Are you making money? And I think that there's another form of success, which is creating a great company in which people are happy, they're inspired, they're motivated to come to work. And if you get that right, I think that the money will come. When people interact with people, whether it's at a brewery or a grocery store or any business, and they're having fun and they love what they do, they tend to be like, what's wrong with you? And they're like, I love my job, I love what I do, and then people are intrigued, and I think that's just so rare these days. And so I think all of those things, I guess, yeah.
So I know you mentioned before that you want to make sure you did it right the first time before you started going outside of the state. On the website it says brewing for a wide range of styles and knowing that there's a beer out there for everyone's palate. That's sounds like something you've really refined over time. Has that changed, or is that just something you've been looking since the start?
Well, I think you get one chance to make a first impression. So whatever you do, don't cut corners. Maybe that's will give you some short-term gains, but in the long term it'll hurt you. And so there's no shortcuts, and I kind of think that's the truth overall, So when it comes to beer styles, I think that there's a lot of different palates out there, and so making sure to offer a wide variety for many different people is important, but then also know what you're good at. And then experiment and innovation is important in our industry, and so being nimble and being willing to innovate, and you got to be willing to fail sometimes. Otherwise, you'll never hit a home run if you don't strike out. And so for us, we do, I think we specialize in probably hop-forward styles. We like very clean beers. But at the same time, we want to offer some malt-forward beers for people with that palate. We want to make some sour and some wild beers that we're passionate about because they're really intriguing and fun. Just offering the whole variety, and then now people want a hazy beer, something that everything has told me, and my opinion is that they are wrong. But if the market's telling you that is right, well then you can't be stuck in your ways so much to not listen to the world because it's constantly changing. I think the craft beer world's quite interesting as an industry to study because it's been around forever. And yet it's had these waves of resurrection and revitalization where there's been a proliferation of breweries at different times, especially over the last 50 years in different moments. And over the last 8 years, it's just exploded. And so there's businesses doing it the right way, businesses doing it the wrong way, people cutting shortcuts, people doing it just right. And there's not a perfect formula. Everyone's business models are different. And so I just think, getting off topic, but you know, doing whatever you do to the best. And so even if you're getting outside your box and you're saying, well, I'm going to make a beer I've never made before, well, we better do our research and our due diligence to make sure that when we do it, it's the best possible take on it that we can provide. And then if it's not good, having the guts to dump it.
So how do you know it's good and not good? How do you know when?
Like, do you reach out to the population? Say, hey,
I mean, it helps when you're a consumer, right? Because I'm a consumer, I'm a craft beer lover, and so, and most of our team are, I mean, all of us really. That's not always the case. So we can go by what feels good to us too, and what we see in the market. I think when it usually comes to a lot of beers, there's just basic fundamental principles that if you're not hitting, you know, then the beer shouldn't be sold commercially. And so carbonation levels, clarity, shelf stability are just things that, you know, no matter what beer you make, you should always have those variables there. And if you don't, then you shouldn't even really be selling it commercially. And usually if you have those things in place, then it's all based on palates. You know, I mean, we have beers that some people are like, this is my desert island beer. If I could drink one beer the rest of my life, this is it. And someone right next to them be like, that shit is disgusting. I can't drink it. It's the worst thing I've ever had. And that's just the array of palates out there. And you could make the best beer possible, and someone's going to tell you it's horrible. And sometimes criticism's hard to hear, but that's just the reality of putting yourself out there.
How did you obtain your palate per se? Because I'm sure there's an experience level to get to a point where you can come out to, you know what I mean?
Yes and no. You know, I think that everyone has a palate, right? And there's nothing that's more sophisticated necessarily than anyone else's. I think I've had some training in off flavors and things you don't want to taste in beer due to problems in
Other breweries
in the brewing. What's that?
to get the training on like the off.
Typically, they actually have like a chemistry kit, and they'll actually like take a beer and they'll dose it with different off flavors, and then you can actually isolate just that one thing. And then normally you'll see a blend of off flavors out there, but being able to isolate them gives you a good view. Some people have these really refined palates, right, that can pick out just the most subtle flavors, and that's really great. But I think that at least with our product, it's just about, does it taste good? Don't overanalyze it. Does it taste good? And that's what matters most. You know, sometimes we laugh a little bit because right now there's a lot of craft beer geeks, you know, and people that maybe obsess over these extremely small nuances. And sometimes, is the beer good? You know, did you enjoy it? You know, and so I think you can have the most refined palate, but at the end of the day, it typically doesn't matter. Is it good beer? Did you enjoy it? I had a friend that he wanted to find the best beer in the world. And he went on this quest, literally, and traveled. And it wasn't about the best beer, per se, but it was the best beer at the best moment. And so the best beer ended up being, for him, a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale on the top of a mountain at this particular moment when it was just like the perfect moment and the perfect beer came together at the right time, and that's what made the perfect beer. You know, the ranking lists that are out there and the competitions and the medals, I think are really silly. We recently had a question about medals, and it was like, some people gauge success based on that, you know, and I think looking for that validation. And I think that for us, we feel like we got a voter that we win when people order a 7C's pint, when they buy a 7C six-pack. You know, that's the consumer making a choice, and that's the biggest win. And that's where consumers have their biggest voice, you know, in making decisions, supporting good companies and making decisions against ones where maybe they don't.
So my question is, so you start this journey is from like 08, 09, and now like 10 years, so you can all see the technology have been shifting in your area, and how did you use that technological advantage in terms of your back end department like manufacturing and your front end is like.
Well, it's
wow.
interesting, right? I mean, brewing beer is like thousands of years old. There's a fantastic documentary about how beer has saved civilization many times over, and how it's the basis of math and written language, and there's like just proof to so, and it's pretty fascinating. It's actually Discovery Channel made this documentary, but it's amazing, right? And the process has changed, but it's also just the same. You know, it's chemistry, it's Mother Nature. There's yeast floating in this room right now. You could, you know, brew a beer on your desk without even knowing it, really, or make alcohol. I think that there's been some technology that's been, you know, helpful and assisted, you know, and you don't need it, but it's nice to have, and it makes your operation more efficient. I've heard breweries called craft brewing blissfully inefficient, because you're trying to make the best of something. You know, it's not all about necessarily homogenization and everything. There's just some inherent losses that take place. I think that most of the technology is probably centered around shelf stability and packaging. It goes all the way up. I guess for us, we had a very manual system. We used to take 5-gallon buckets of grain and dump it into a vessel and stir it with a manual paddle. And then at a certain point, we purchased a larger brew house that utilized rakes that move around inside. And at that size, you can't use a paddle. And so it was necessary. Packaging equipment, you know, you want to make sure you're putting the best possible beer on the shelf. And if you use poor packaging equipment, you know, the beer will degrade quicker. And so I think there's those things, there's some things you just want to buy new. And for us, you know, boilers, packaging lines, things that when they break or when they don't work right, seriously alter the landscape of what you can do or shut down your operations. And everyone uses different bells and whistles, I guess. You know, we just brought online a centrifuge, and that's become pretty common in the beer industry, whereas typically for craft brewers, you didn't see them maybe 6-8 years ago. But they're expensive, which is probably some of the reason, but they provide more flexibility in filtration and clarification, and then efficiency, so they pay for themselves. You're able to run some slurry product that you would normally dump down the drain, but contains perfectly good beer, and you're able to separate it. And those yields alone pay for themselves. And so I think typically if you're going to add a piece of technology, it should make the beer better. And at the same time, you know, not get you too far away from the process. If there comes a point where the person that runs a brewery is sitting at a computer panel, I just don't, that's nothing that we want to experience. I can't knock the guys that do, right? It's very efficient and very consistent, which is probably the hardest and the biggest, you know, thing that we all reach for is consistency. But then you just lose everything that's fun and great about craft beer, in my opinion, when human hands no longer touch the process at any point. But that's just, you know, that's just me.
How many gallons do of beer you produce a month? I mean, talk about consistency. You're talking about thousands of gallons.
I mean, we're still relatively small in the scheme of things. This year, basically do 310,000 gallons, I think, you know, off the top of my head. So.
That's a lot of gallons, though, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, that's like, what is that, that's 2.4 million pints, something like that.
So as far as like your resources, I know you said you're trying to stay locally. Like I know the price can be, you know, dramatically different depending on where you get your sources from. How is that affected?
Sourcing local ingredients. Well, I know a lot of this is just very unique to beer, but I think we're very fortunate here in the Northwest because our proximity to Yakima. You know, stats are changing a little bit, but like something like 70% of the world's hops come out of Yakima. It's just an epicenter for it. And so we're very fortunate there. Skagit Valley malting, there's starting to be some actual malt production happening in Skagit Valley, which is really interesting. Normally, Eastern Washington, Oregon, and beyond is where a lot of the base malt comes from. I think that with what we do, you want to make the best beer possible, and so whatever the ingredients you need is just what it is. And then some people want to know what each keg of beer or pint of beer costs to the penny, and then price based on marking it up. People have fundamental different views on that. I look at the market, and if everyone's selling beer at $5 a pint, well, that's where my beer needs to be. Maybe some people choose a niche where it's a $15 beer, right? It's a very exclusive barrel-aged beer that took many years to make, and that's their model. So I tend to go to the grocery store and to the pub and see what prices are, and you kind of need to fall in line, in my opinion. I don't like to be the top, I don't like to be the bottom. I like to be someplace approachable and reasonable in the middle.
I know pricing is a rather hard subject to come across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, usually there'll be like a big sweep, like one distributor will say, hey, we want to raise prices on kegs. And if they're a big enough distributor, well then everyone will kind of go that way. And some people will adopt it immediately and some people won't. And I like some people to go out there and, be the one to break through that door first, and then I'll come 30 to 60 days later. And once that people aren't so shocked that they stopped buying the products, but at the same time, you gotta move with the industry as well.
Yeah. Has the hop industry been able to keep up with the demand considering the rapid growth?
Too much so. I mean, it's pretty interesting, right? Craft breweries exploded. They all wanted a somewhat different variety of hop, different hop characteristics than what hop growers were growing. It takes typically like 3 years when they plant a hop vine in the ground until they get a full production off the vine. And so they reacted. They planted all these very specific varieties that craft brewers wanted. Craft brewers were like, I'm growing at 100% a year, 50% a year. So they projected out many years in the future at that type of growth. Well, the industry is now slowing. People sign contracts several years out committing to those hops. And now I think hop growers have now basically overplanted to some extent on some varieties because of craft brewers betting on the future. And I think it's just like any other industry. It's like if you're a contractor or a developer, right? What happened in 2008? I mean, times are good, great. They're not always going to be that good. You never want to be so heavily leveraged that if something big happened, you're gone. And so I think that's kind of what's starting to happen right now. Is I see craft breweries closing their doors now, because you could hang on and be successful for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, maybe even 7 years. But eventually those bad business decisions or those corners that you cut come back to bite you. And that's a real thing that I see happening at this very moment.
What is the percentage of beer consumption in the United States? What percentage of it is craft brewery?
It's changing. And the hop thing, moving target, right? It's so interesting that agricultural product that reacts the way it does. And so I think figuring it out, I think what's interesting is that if you sign a contract, you have a responsibility to pay it. People produce those hops, and what you saw were craft brewers were signing contracts, very big ones, and they weren't paying them. And then the hop grower was the one getting stuck in a not so good position. And so I think that that sometimes business ethics have to trickle down a little bit, and don't shoot for the stars and over-promise and then sign your name on the line and then back away from it. And so there was a hop grower that went out of business, I think a year ago, and people not paying their bills and over-projecting.
Co-ops set up so that the really small guys could get access to hop?
Typically growers will sell to a processor or the middleman through, and yeah. But it's fascinating, and we live so close. I mean, going to Yakima during harvest is an amazing drive, and it's so close. It's like just a marvel to see, I think, in person. And then you had asked about
Consumption,
consumption. I know it's changing, and I don't,
10% or?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the number in my mind. Is I think it was probably a year or two ago where we broke the 10% threshold market share, and that was the big double-digit number milestone to hit for us. And so now what you see is the beer market's not growing. We're just taking away market share from the domestics. Hence why the domestics have reacted by buying craft breweries so that they could diversify and get some of that piece of the pie as well. And those guys they're savvy. They know what they're doing. They've been doing it for a long time. And so it's interesting to see that all kind of go down.
Do you think, what's your opinion on the Tacoma market as far as saturation of microbreweries and stuff? And just
Thomas, that's a touchy question to
There's
ask.
a half dozen that are walking distance from here.
How do I put it? The stats are crazy right now as far as how many breweries are within X miles of the population. I don't think there's no one in the United States that's more than 10 miles from a craft brewery or some insane stat. It's fascinating. But, I think there's room for more beer in Tacoma. I think there's a lot more room for good beer in Tacoma. I think that Washington in general is the land of small breweries. I think there's over 350 breweries in Washington State right now, which is like one of the largest of any state in the U.S. But when you look at production, we're like 17th. And so you've got states that have fewer breweries, but they've got substantially sized breweries. Whereas here for a long time it was like, oh, there's a Red Hook here. Well, in other states there's 5 Red Hooks that are all regional, national players. And Washington State has only had very few companies break through that ceiling. And right now you see some as well, that have some ability to travel and have opportunity to become regional. But it's an ongoing question of why hasn't Washington had breweries, break through a larger regional and national presence? And you can tie it to a lot of things, but I think that's true in Tacoma. There's a lot of us that are smaller brewers, and I think that it's interesting. Some people feel that Seven Seas is a large brewery, and we're not. I think the building is quite large across the street, and that sends that impression. But we'll produce probably 10,000 barrels of beer this year. And in the scheme of things, that is a very small brewery, very small. And but when you have many that are making 500 or 1,000 barrels, it seems big, but looks can be deceiving. And I just don't think without other players of sizable scale in the area, people just don't see that level of a benchmark.
So how do you sustain your competitive edge? Meaning that, are you going to try to diversify your Seven Seas and getting into like spirits or anything like that?
No, I mean never say never. I think is key to say. Like we've toyed around with a bunch of product diversifications. Whether it's beverage or not. So you never know. We've partnered on a food truck before. We've kicked around nitro cold brew coffee. We've talked about spirits before. Those are all interesting, but they're all distractions from what our focus is. And I always think some of those basic principles that I learned in school, that having a mission statement and a vision statement and revisiting those statements every once in a while and making sure you didn't get too far off track is really a good practice. And for us, we want to make the best beer possible and focus on beer production. And all that other stuff is ancillary and a distraction. And that's why our business model doesn't involve us with a restaurant. We come up with creative solutions to the food thing and feedback we've gotten from customers, but we want to stay focused on what we're good at, what we're passionate about. And I think that you see that typically a lot. I think there's a popular business model for a long time in brew pubs, but it's hard to run a restaurant and a brewery really well simultaneously. And we saw that. And I just want to focus on making the best beer possible and keep the focus there. And it can be done. Some people do both really well, but just our vision.
Are you in all 50 states?
We are only in Washington State.
No, I mean your product itself.
Yeah. Yeah, we are only distributed within Washington State.
Oh, really?
We send a little bit of beer out to Japan,
Okay.
but pretty minor. We were talking about this a little bit just before we got started, but we personally kind of kept the reins pretty close. And so there's breweries that are our size and our age that may be distributed in 6 or 8 states. And it's kind of a tell to me of how well their beer is and how well it does. Because if you have to sprinkle 10,000 barrels over 6 states, well, I'd rather have my backyard have a really healthy, established market here where you're relevant, where the beer is freshest, is going to taste the best. And then as time goes on, when the timing's appropriate, branch out. It's just really simple. I mean, for every mile further you get away from the brewery, the beer is going to degrade slightly. And maybe it's very minute, but then you go to the next state, and then you go across the country. And that's also why you've got some of the larger players building East Coast operations. Between shipping costs and the time and the lack of freshness that is then achieved when you send it coast to coast, becomes a real financial ability to just build another brewery. So only within Washington State currently, and purposefully so. And but that's not the long-term vision. It's just I think that for us, we have foregone growth and dollars to build the sturdiest foundation possible to be able to grow on when the timing's appropriate. And now that timing's starting to become appropriate. So, being patient with expansions and funding. So we've worked with the SBA and internal, just self-funding our expansions. And you can go out and get a loan. Someone will give you a loan for 12% if you want, and one bad business transaction can be the nail in the coffin for you that everything else could be going great, but you made one bad decision. And so you got to, I think, be delicate there. And for us, owning our own real estate, having the ability to scale, having those things in place were important for us rather than, reaching a point of maxing out a space, have to put the brakes on your distributors and sales until you can find a new home. And financing, real estate, construction, permitting, all of the things that go on with a move and building out a facility is not a quick endeavor, always surprises and challenges. And so if your business is on a great sales trajectory, sometimes hitting the brakes, you can't always get that trajectory back, and your distributor or the world move on to the next product that is available. And so I think for us, building that foundation so that when the time is appropriate to be able to grow substantially, we're ready for it, is something that we've spent a lot of time on over the past 9 years.
So after the initial seed money when you were first starting, did you go raise more, or did you just kind of?
It took two initial sums of money for us to get started. We purchased our brewing equipment initially, and that was just because the brewery went out of business. It was the right size system. It was the right price. It was a brewery that closed down on South Lake Union in Seattle. We had heard the system was for sale, and we went up there and met with the owner, and we still know him to this day, but we brought a check and said, what's the price? And he said, oh shit, man, I've talked to a lot of people about this. A lot of people come talk to me about it, but no one's been ready. The bank technically still owns the equipment. And so we said, well, we're obviously ready. Let's do this. And so the second round came when we actually needed a physical location. And these are all really fairly small sums of money. I kind of definition in a lot of ways of just bootstrapping. I find that being willing to diversify your skill set is important. So we save a ton of money by learning from different people. So we now have, plumbing capabilities, electrician capabilities, woodworking, you name it, and those are skills we've developed in-house that save us so much money.
So kind of going along with that, what do you do with your spent grain, if anything?
Our spent grain goes to a local farmer in Enumclaw with 2,500 cattle. He's got probably 20 of these semi-truck trailers that are all throughout different breweries and distilleries in Washington State. And I think it's still only about 10% of the feed for his cows. And so for us, it's a byproduct, but it's not waste, right? There's something to be gotten from it. And so, and if you think about it too, right, you've got this grain in the back, right, and then you've got yeast in the air. You actually see a small amount of fermentation taking place naturally. And so the cows are probably getting like a slight buzz. They're probably very happy cows. And for him, it's great, right? He gets like basically some of the highest quality feed for his cows for free in a lot of ways. He has to come up with trucking and logistics to figure it out. And some breweries charge for it. Typically, you just want it gone. I want it gone, I want it done clean, I don't want to worry about it. And so they come in the middle of the night and they swap trailers, we never see them, and there's a new trailer there. And if it backs up and you can't get rid of it, your whole operation stopped. And so it's important to have a good outlet for that, and that's what makes that possible for us. I know that some other people are doing, I've seen some people working on paper from the byproduct, fire bricks, like compressing it into fire bricks. So I think there's a lot of other people looking at, waste streams and how can you utilize it.
So for, like, one of the folks who said that I wish college taught me QuickBooks. So,
Thomas wrote that up for me.
We kind of talked about it too, right?
Yeah.
so my kind of question is, us students in college, what would you say is the most practical thing we can learn that, for example, when you're in a stressful situation, what are the questions you ask yourself? How to get from like the problem to the solution? Like, what would we learn? What do we need to learn to, be able to follow the process?
I think that for entrepreneurship, the practical point is really key, right? I mean, I was surprised that I took an accounting class and I got drugged through debits and credits, which I hated. And then the most fundamental things about just QuickBooks. Any small business, and maybe that's not your hope, right? I mean, maybe you don't want to start a small business, so it's not important. Maybe you want to work for a large corporation or whatever it is. But QuickBooks is just this entry-level business 101, right? That would be key. Certainly something really helpful there was reading financial statements. So knowing a balance sheet and an income statement, that's lesson learned. I think that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and so it goes both ways. Sometimes I think the best business partner is no business partner. However, there can be good situations. I think I'm very fortunate in that I have an awesome business partner, and our strengths and weaknesses balance each other out well. And we had some very honest, frank discussions early on because we heard of all these scenarios where things didn't go well for companies. And that's the death of the company, right? Is that people fought, and that's what got them passed. And having those discussions, and something I heard when I was going to school, that was really key, And so we just flat out told each other, I'm sure that I'm going to want to punch you in the face on more than one occasion. And we will inevitably get to that point. And then taking a deep breath and calming down and knowing that we have the same goals in mind here is key. And mutual respect and all these things, but it's a marriage. Like having been with my business partner for 10 years and being married for 4, they're very similar, And sometimes it's the best possible marriage or business partner, the more it hurts, right? The more you suck it up and talk about things you don't want to talk about and talk through things, tends to mean your relationship's growing and getting better. And so I think, QuickBooks, practical knowledge, I think that at the end of the day, like the willingness to do whatever it takes, is really key, I think, and having that drive and making sure that if people tell you that's silly or you can't do that, fuel to the fire. You know, can't take no for an answer.
So I had a question about this.
Creative problem solving. It's all creative problem solving, and you face new problems every day. And I think that just myself, like the amount of personal growth that goes on being a business owner is insane, because of all the situations you come across and all the stressful scenarios. I think like trying to be balanced and take a deep breath and put things in perspective is always important. And I say this now thinking in my head that I need to do that like right now. It's never perfect, but getting frustrated clouds your judgment, and that's not helpful. And so you gotta take a walk, clear your head, get back to a better place. And the method, I think, comes back to the scientific method. As you've got a problem, and man, I'd have to get a book to actually remember the exact method, but you basically analyze the problem, and then you come up with a hypothesis, and you test them, and then you find out what it is, and I find that you use that every day. And then you try to not have the same problem happen twice, so learn from it, and if you don't find out why something didn't work, well then the odds of you repeating that are there. So figure it out, and don't just say, oh, that's weird, that happened. Well, I want to know why it happened so it doesn't happen again. And some people just drop it initially, and you're like, well, we might as well learn from this and not recreate and improve ourselves, but you got to be willing to do that. So I think the scientific method's like the easiest way to approach a problem and come up with different scenarios and solve it from there.
Could you provide an example of creative problem solving in your experience?
Oh man, there are so many. It's hard to wrap my head around. Creative problem solving.
You talked about learning the chemical classes for like the pick something. You got the certification.
Well, yeah, I mean, like a half hour ago, our garage. I had heard this happen, but it never happened to me. And our garage door isn't lifting up. You press the button, and it raises a foot. And so as soon as I leave here, I'm going to go back, and I pulled the cord, so that the door could become free. There's no spring, so it immediately just dropped to the ground. Oh, no. And so I'm going to go back with the forklift and lift it up. And I mean, I guess like some engineering and some MacGyver. MacGyver was my favorite show growing up, so I really enjoyed that. I think thinking outside the box and, trying to look at problems from a unique perspective or backing away and not always taking, your initial approach is always really important. Let's say that we overproduced a beer, right? And it's getting towards its shelf life date. Creative solution can be doing a sale in the tap room, a case special, to sell through that product. That's a simple one. Is we don't want to destroy this product when it gets old. Why not, offer it at a reduced price, but only in a case? And that's honestly only happened once to us, but a lot of people do that regularly. Creative problem solving. The guys in front of our building right now that are doing the water line extension, they found out that they had a valve that's the wrong size, and it stalled the project right in front of our front door. And so they can't find it. They found one in Spokane, and I guess it's not creative, right? But I was like, do you want me to drive to Spokane to pick up a valve for you guys? Because, you're making an excuse, right? Like you're gonna maybe wait for a shipping company to ship it out, and meanwhile hold up the project and cost all this money. Like I can just jump in a truck tonight for you and go pick it up, and I won't charge you too much. But the ability to do whatever it takes, and I think that scientific method and looking at, you got to look at what's crazy and insane as a solution, and all these crazy out there ideas before you can find the one that makes sense just right. And so sometimes, when you're brainstorming a problem or a solution or an idea, like getting extreme sometimes to put it in perspective, and then being able to come back to what the solution or the answer is, it gave you a frame of reference, I think so.
So I was going to ask you, I know you're talking about being on your own about creative solutions, but have you built partnerships with other breweries that may have experienced the same issues?
Totally. I think that building a network is also really important, and those are just parts of that problem solving. And so I think relationships are key. I think there's hundreds of people that I can say that I have a relationship with that have helped 7Cs in a huge way, and owe a ton to them.
And how is 7C's given back to, like, say, other companies?
Well, typically beer. Yeah. I mean, we're fortunate to have a pretty good barter chip, and to say thanks, I think it typically is well received. I mean, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's a thank you, sometimes it's returning the favor. And the best is when, someone helps you out of the kindness of helping out, and you can return that favor. I mean, to me, that's the ideal scenario. And I think that's what was unique about the craft beer industry to start. And it's still there, but with the proliferation, some slight amount is dissipated. But there's always been a really good community where people have helped each other out. If someone's in a pinch, something's broke, someone's out of an ingredient, whatever it is, it's just a phone call away. And it's very unique to have that camaraderie and not just competition. And I think that, at the end of the day, just making the best possible beer is competition, right? You don't have to go duke it out and, try to throw each other under the bus. How about you just make the best beer possible, we make the best beer possible, and the consumer will decide. And so I think that kind of approach allows camaraderie. So, yeah.
One of the big issues facing businesses now is the obtaining of competent labor. Are you finding
Absolutely.
any of that?
Yeah.
What do you
Oh, goodness. That is hard. People that take pride in their work, I just think are few and far between these days. People that enjoy working hard and at the end of the day, like looking at their hard work and feeling good about what they've done. We've encountered, people that the goal is to make as much money as possible with the littlest amount of work possible. And if that's what drives you in life, you don't belong at 7Cs. If you like to maintain, we're also not a company for you. We believe in pushing the needle and growing the company and our staff and our knowledge and quality and all those things. And we're never going to be complacent. And so that doesn't align with sometimes what people want. And that's a real challenge. And when you get people that take pride in what they do and are passionate about the business, making sure that they're happy and comfortable and that, that those people are retained is important. And company culture, and creating that, I think, is some of the hardest part of it. It's that financial success versus the success of a company that works well. And at the same time, I know that I'm not really good at it. I've hired some people before that were fantastic interviewing, felt really good about, and then turned out to not work out. And it got to a point where I was like, I must suck at being HR, hiring. I don't know the right questions to ask in the interviewing process. I don't know how to get down to the telltale signs. And no one's perfect at it, I'm sure, but it's hard. And sometimes people are the right fit, sometimes they aren't. But I think there's just those fundamental principles that people like working hard and they take pride in their work. Then those are things that if you can find, those are the right people. That's hard.
One thing I've been following your company ever since the beginning, since you first opened up your first tasting room at Gig Harbor. I actually have a couple of the growlers from those first 2 years.
Yeah.
Dutch growlers. I'm really a big fan of your labeling and your logo work. Is that all done internally, or do you use outside?
It's a combination. I think it's interesting, we've developed our graphics and our brands organically over time and stemming from us. And there comes a point where a lot of companies go to a design firm and they say, build me a brand. And you can there's people that specialize in that, and they'll build you a logo and a sales sheet and a whole thing, right? And it's turnkey. You got a brand. And there's nothing wrong with that. I guess I just really enjoyed our approach, and that it was developed organically. Myself, Travis, me sitting down with an artist trying to get what's in my brain on paper and finding an artist or a designer that you work well with that way, and then it's never perfect. And so, we've not rebranded, but we've refreshed things a couple times, and I think constant improvement. I think finding the people that truly can get what's in your brain on the paper just took us a while to find because we're pretty particular. And then I like to say devil's in the details. And so sometimes the designers we work with probably think I'm like slightly crazy, but it's the small nuances and the details, not just in marketing, but in taproom finishes or whatever. And I think that the things that drive you crazy that are the details you can't let go, even though no one probably notices them, you feel, are the things that as an aggregate set you apart from other people that, I don't care,
Kind of like when you build a fence in your backyard and you know where all the little mistakes are. Every time you go out there, you see them, but when your guests come over, they don't see it.
Mm-hmm. But the odds are that fence will probably be standing longer than, than another fence that was built without that care.
Right.
And so I think the devil's in the details. And so,
It really is.
Sometimes you feel like, why am I doing this? No one cares. Like, I'm the only one that's going to see this or whatever. And those things do matter. And I think that you're your own worst enemy sometimes. Sometimes you're OCD in particular about one thing so much that it stresses you out. But that's also maybe what makes you a slight genius at whatever it is you do. And so it's a double-edged sword.
So what's the end game for 7 Seas?
I don't know. When breweries were getting purchased, that was a pretty common question that everyone kind of got asked. It's like, oh, would you sell? And a lot of people are like, no, I would never sell to the man. Like, no way. Right. And I was like, wow, that's really naive and stupid, for someone to say. Like, that's the thing you say when you haven't thought through the question. The reality is if someone came up and offered you a grotesque amount of money, 10 times what your company's worth, you'd be a fucking idiot not to at least fully consider it. Not saying that you're going to go with it, but first off, get flattered, and then consider it. To say you wouldn't consider such an offer is just silly. And, in our world of beer, right, people were very, these guys are the enemies, Budweiser and Miller, and, that's not necessarily the case, and you got to respect them for what they're good at. But so never say never. But we're passionate about, building 7 Seas into something that's an amazing company to work for, that's, that's healthy and lively and innovative, and creates a culture and fan base around it. And I think we got a lot of hard work ahead of us to do that. And the foundation that we've worked on for a long time hopefully allows us to do that. You take a risk like a big building like that, and you cross your fingers. Hopefully one day I get to fill it up. It's a calculated risk, and there's a chance it may not. I think also at the end of the day, I'm so personally entwined in 7 Seas as a person that you also have to realize it's a business. And having a family and doing some of those things puts it all in perspective, and that, it's work. And that's something interesting people say, like, what if you never had to work another day in your life? And not doing, what if you never had to work another day doing something that you didn't feel like doing? You can work because you like work, but if you never needed to do the shit you don't like to do, like, who wouldn't necessarily be pretty intrigued by that? But I don't really foresee, selling as something that's on the horizon for 7 Seas at all. I think that, we're at a great spot right now, and we're best poised for success with the team that's currently in place and the current climate. And we'll see where the roller coaster ride, continues to take us.
So entrepreneurship, I always tell the students here that it's a full contact sport. And so you've been married for about 4 years now, you said.
Mm-hmm.
How do you convince your wife that, hey, I'm an entrepreneur, and sometimes my reality isn't like corporate America's?
I think I'm fortunate because I work with my wife too. And so if she didn't see what I was doing, I think, it would be a lot harder to be in a relationship when you have that much going on. So I think that's actually a strength for us, and we're crazy enough to do it, whereas for a lot of people that's like the worst scenario ever. It's the unattainable life balance that I think certainly entrepreneurs and we all strive for, is the work-life balance. And so, you know, I've worked like 20-hour days before, back to back, where I found my line. You know, I've walked the edge and I tiptoed just back from it on cracking. And so you have to be really self-aware and take care of yourself, you know, and not lose track of, hey, if I'm not healthy, then I can't support and do the work that I need to do to make other people do their job and be successful. And sometimes you have to push those limits a little bit. But I think, you know, being willing to do whatever it takes, but at the same time, keep it in perspective and take a deep breath is key. And that's the demise of a lot of companies right there, is just overdoing it. You know, what are you doing all the work for?
Right. What would you say, like, what was like your biggest failure, or what are your significant failures, and what did you learn from them, apart from getting your first brewery burned down? But
luckily that wasn't my fault. So I was pretty happy that when I tell that story, I always let them know that it was someone else. You know, there's been a few people I've let down. You know, that didn't have the tools to be successful because I didn't put the time in to work with them to give them that. But due to outside surroundings, that was just it. There was this, like, I think back to college, and it's mind-boggling. Like, you know, you're like, I used to be able to sleep in and have some time, and there comes a point where you go, there is literally not enough hours in the day now. And I never thought that this, when people said that, I was like, that's silly, you know? I mean, look at all this. There's literally not enough hours in the day, and I think that sometimes I struggle with, I want to do things the right way, I want to do them 100%, but sometimes you're spread so thin you can only do things at 80%, or you do one thing at 100, but then something goes to 60. And that's, you know, something that personally upsets me, you know, that I'm not super happy about, but you accept that sometimes that's reality. You know, I've made a few silly decisions. I bought a two-door reach-in cooler at a grocery store auction. So we thought outside the box, and we buy used equipment at auctions sometimes. And I bought this thing, and I realized that it doesn't have the compressor that allows it to be plugged into a wall and work. It's basically a useless piece of shit I paid $1,000 for. And it was massive, and I had to take it. And then I took it to the recycling center, and they wouldn't take it.
Oh, no.
And this thing was in the back of my truck, and it's like 12 feet tall with the truck. And I thought I was gonna have to pay someone to take my $1,000 thing I just bought, and I was pissed. And I ended up having someone, I had to give it to him for scrap. But there's large failures and small failures, and I think sometimes, you know, when you feel like you just get kicked when you're down and that it's just horrible, right? It's the end of it. That keeping it in perspective and taking a deep breath, I found that sometimes fast forward a week or a day or a month, and you're like, this all worked out for the better. You know, it's like the fire, it's like some other challenges we've had where you think it's done, that, you know, that, geez, man, I can't believe this just happened, I'm broken. You know, how are we gonna recover from this? And then it all ends up for the better. And you just gotta have a little faith that, you know, if it's meant to be, it'll be, and if it's not, it's not, and that's just what it is. And there's only so much you can do out there too. And so sometimes, you know, you just, you can't take excuses, you gotta get things done, but then you gotta realize sometimes that it's not possible. Yeah.
Any more questions?
Thank you.
Cool. Guys, thanks for having me. It's cool.